1 Corinthians 7, 6 through 9. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. When I was a kid, we had a ceramic pig dressed up as a chef. All right, I don't know exactly why or where this ceramic pig chef came from. My mom, she likes kind of quirky art things like that. So if you were at her house, you'd see a number of different things that are just kind of like, it's a little different, a little quirky. So we had this ceramic pig chef, right? It's about like 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. And for some reason, it was deemed prudent for this ceramic pig chef to sit not like against a wall somewhere. And it had this little chalkboard too that you could write messages on it. Right, so maybe that's why it sat where it did. It sat right on our kitchen island, right, like right on the corner. All right, now, my mom, she loved this thing. I don't know why she had such an attachment to the ceramic pig chef, but she did. And you may be guessing where this story is going. And if you were to ask my brother or my sister how exactly the pig got knocked over and destroyed, I'm confident they both would point the finger at me, right? And there's a lot of shenanigans going on whenever this happened years and years ago, and a lot of finger pointing. The result was the pig got broken. Right? My mom, she was heartbroken, and my sister, bless her heart, right? My sister, she tried to like glue this ceramic pig chef back together again, but to no avail. It was empty on the inside, right? And so the pieces are just everywhere. They just wouldn't fit back together. I share this because many of us grew up with promises of marriage that resemble a ceramic pig chef. We were told promises that we would, in fact, get married. Promises that marriage would stand tall and proud like the ceramic pig chef, even if our marriages maybe were a bit quirky. These are the kind of promises that were held out to us. But like that ceramic pig chef, the promises were ultimately empty and all too easily shattered. As we look at these verses this morning, I don't want to stand here and hold out to you, especially you who are unmarried. I don't want to hold out to you empty, breakable promises about the marriage you may desire or the marriage that you wish you had. Rather, I want you to know that you can trust the Lord to give to you good gifts. You can trust Him to give you what you need when you need it. Similar to last week's focus on marriage, in the passage there that we looked at, say this morning, our passage is not just for those among us who are unmarried. You who are married, you need to wrestle with what the Apostle Paul is saying here. Because you were unmarried once. You may be unmarried yet again. And you have children who are unmarried. And most significantly, you have brothers and sisters here whom you have covenanted with, who are unmarried, who we have a responsibility to help grow up together in Christ as they do with us who are married. Just wonder if you could put a number on it. If you were to estimate what percent of our covenant members are unmarried, what would you say? We've got 79 covenant members. Of that group, our membership here, 79, what percent would you say are unmarried? It's 30. 30% of our church is unmarried. So we who are married, we need to be equipped to help them follow Christ in all of life, just as they walk with us who are married. Just as the passage we looked at last week, they need to be equipped to help us, even in such delicate and personal aspects of marriage as we discussed last week. We need to be doing the same. We're in this together, helping one another, trust in the Lord and all of his goodness, all of his gifts for us, his wise, providential gifts for us. So our outline this morning, it's rather straightforward, not very creative. Four points as we walk through these 4 verses. The concession, the wish, the gift, and the command. The concession, the wish, the gift, the command. All right, so the concession Paul makes in verse 6 relates back to that Corinthian slogan that we have considered before, there in verse 1, where Paul quotes this sentiment that is prevalent among them, that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, right? As we considered last week, he soundly rejects that assertion within the context of marriage and all of its good design. But here, he's conceding his limited agreement with that assertion, right? So he's saying, you say, Corinthians, it's good for a man to not touch a woman within the context of marriage, that pursuing that kind of asceticism is going to lead to greater measure of spirituality, a greater degree of holiness. And he says, no, that is not what you ought to do. And then when we get here to verse 6, he says, now, as a concession, right? Not a command, I say this, right? Now, I am in agreement with you in part. Let me nuance my agreement, right? He agrees that abstinence is a good thing, properly understood and applied. The goal is not abstinence. That is not the highest value that Paul holds out to us, or especially to those who are unmarried. There's been much talk over, especially if you're growing up 80s and 90s, much talk about singleness that's been made, where it comes across that the primary objective for an unmarried Christian is complete and total abstinence, that your whole life is oriented around that solitary goal. Now that is, of course, the standard. That is the expectation, and why Paul made no qualifications whatsoever to his command back in chapter 6, verse 18, to flee sexual immoralities. Right? That is applicable for all of us, married and unmarried. Flee sexual immorality. We should have nothing to do with it. But abstinence, even though it is a good thing, it is not the driving focus of your unmarried life. Abstinence is not the driving focus of your unmarried life. So what is? What is the driving focus that compels you, that controls you? And this is what Paul speaks to in verses 7 and 8 with the wish. Right? Here's the wish, verses 7 and 8. He is expressing here his personal and not moral desire for Christians, for the church. This isn't a command that he is giving. He's saying it would be great if, right? So what is that wish? What is this desire that he is verbalizing? Verse 7, that all people would be as Paul himself is. All right, well, what do you mean, Paul? Like, in what way are you? Right? So this obviously cannot be a moral command, because that would mean the end of marriage and procreation, right? Which is something that Paul is clearly not in favor of, right? So when he's saying, I wish that all were as I am, he can't mean in a objective, complete, total, moral declaration that all Christians everywhere ought to be as he is, right? Otherwise, no one's going to get married and no one's going to have any children. And Paul speaks a lot about marriage and children. Right? So that's clearly, he can't mean that. Right? And so he does help us, and he goes on to clarify further in verse 8, saying that it is good for them, for those who are unmarried and for those who are widows. It's good for them if they remain as I am. That's how he puts it in verse 8, right? So they should remain as I am, right? So he's drawing this comparison between the unmarried and the widows and saying what they are now is what I am like now, and it is good if they stay as I am, right? So this is indicating for us that Paul, he was very likely unmarried or a widower. Not only, right, that is what he's saying, but given the fact of his pedigree that we read of in Philippians 3, that he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and what we know of the historical context that Paul was brought up in and what that would indicate, being a Pharisee of Pharisees, that we can, I think, safely assume that the Apostle Paul was married at some point. We don't know if his wife left him after he came to Christ or if he was a widower. We don't know for sure. We're not told. But what is pretty evident, I think, is that he was married at one point. He's walked through those joys and challenges. But Paul's wish is not merely for all to be unmarried, or for those who are presently unmarried or widowed to remain as such. So 3 reasons why I think this is true, that he's not desiring for all to either be unmarried or for those who are unmarried to stay that way indefinitely. Right? 3 reasons. First, he tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:14 that he would have younger widows to marry, that is his counsel that he gives to this young pastor. That as Timothy is serving the church, say, hey, those younger widows, they really should go and be married. So it can't be that he's desiring everybody everywhere to remain unmarried, even widows. Second, he goes on to say in this chapter that it is no sin for the unmarried to be married. We see that in this chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 36. So he's giving this kind of permission, saying, yes, go ahead and be married. That is no sin. And then, of course, most immediately here in our context, he issues a command. He says, you ought to marry. There in, not verse 4, verse 9. They ought to marry. Right? So he's not speaking as a blanket statement when he's speaking of this wish. So what is it that he's wishing for? What is he really after? That all would be fully devoted to the Lord. Right? That is what he would desire. And he explains in verses 32 through 34 how this plays out and why this would be the case. In that context that we'll, God willing, get to here in a couple weeks, the unmarried have a freedom from being anxious about the things of this world. And instead, they have the opportunity to be anxious solely about the things of the Lord. And so I think Paul is expressing his wish that all Christians might be fully devoted to the Lord. So just imagine, right, if that wish of the Apostle Paul came to fruition, imagine how forcefully the cause of Christ would advance in the world if that were the case. Just think about, yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, man, that would be amazing. As I labor alongside our other pastors to equip and mobilize you as disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus, as we try to help you to be following Christ in all of life, it would be so much simpler, so much more efficient if you all didn't have families. If you didn't have spouses, if you didn't have mortgages, if you didn't have hobbies, if you didn't have other employments, if you were fully devoted to the Lord, anxious solely about the things of the Lord, man, we could get some stuff done around here. Right? That would be wonderful. And there is a benefit to being as Paul was. There is a benefit. That there are unintended consequences that have arisen because of what Paul teaches here. And its application, not his application, but application of what he teaches to singleness. There's unintended consequences. Namely, seeing the unmarried as workhorses. Just think. You might hear it expressed, oh, you don't have a spouse or kids to care for? Great. You can serve in the nursery and help the elderly and provide free childcare for all of our members with children. And you can do this, and you can do that, and you can do this, and you can do that. We can view those who are unmarried as workhorses, but they're not. They're not laborers in the church. They're brothers and sisters. And similar to how it is not in the purview of a husband, as we considered last week, to make demands of his wife, of his marital rights. Right? He doesn't get to demand his rights. It's something that she gives. Right? So also, it's out of line for us who are married to make demands of the time and energy of the unmarried. We don't get to demand, oh, well, now you are going to serve us in this way because you don't have these worldly concerns to take up your time and opportunities. No, church, instead, we welcome those who are unmarried and widowed. We welcome them into our homes. We invite them to our kids' soccer games. We invite them over to celebrate holidays with us. We value them for who they are, not what service they can provide. When instead, the unmarried, when they can apply 2 Corinthians 9 to their status as being unmarried, right? That when they can give cheerfully, not merely of their finances, when they can give cheerfully, not reluctantly or under compulsion of their time and their abilities and their energy and their resources, when they can give of themselves for the building up of the body, it produces in all of us thanksgiving to God. When they're free to leverage the gift that they've been given for the building up of the body, it produces in all of us thanksgiving to God as those who are unmarried are enriched in every way to be generous in every way. And so that's Paul's wish. That's what he would desire to have come about, but are all so gifted. Just by virtue of being unmarried or widowed, does that mean that you are so gifted? I would say evidently not. Verse 7. Look here, verse 7. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. The gift that Paul has in mind is how he himself is, content with being unmarried and devoted fully to the Lord. Now, you may begin to not believe me when I say this, but Pastor Zach and I, we did not plan this. Right? His exhortation and this application, and what I'm seeing here from verse 7, we did not coordinate this. Now, maybe he read the Bible and read our sermon passage, like, oh, I wonder if this is a fitting application and particular exhortation. Perhaps. We didn't plan this, right? So we don't always scheme like this. But contentment is what Paul is after here, right? It's his spiritual secret, like Pastor Zach helpfully described for us there in Philippians 4:12 through 13. What he goes on even to instruct later in this chapter, I think would fit under that banner of contentment as he talks about different callings, different vocations, and how he would exhort the church in verse 17, writing this, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. Right? You don't have to leave your manner of life. If you're circumcised, don't try to be uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't go and get circumcised. If you are married, stay married. Don't leave your spouse just because you came to Christ. If you're unmarried, perhaps the Lord would give you a gift of contentment to remain unmarried, right? He goes through a slew of different vocations, holding out to us. You don't have to go and completely upend your life now that you've come to Christ. Be content there and where the Lord has called you. So seeing that that's where he's going, let's look, right? Or what is he saying here? This gift. Can you be content being unmarried and fully devoted to the purposes of the Lord? You who are unmarried or widowed, could you do that? Can you be content with that calling upon your life? If so, praise the Lord. Praise God that he has gifted you to be as Paul was. That's astounding. That is something that we should rejoice over and give thanks to the Lord for, that he would bestow upon you such a gift. But each has his own gift. Not everybody has the same gift. His own grace gift is to try to convey the sense of what Paul is after here. It's not just a Christmas present, a birthday gift. Right? This is a grace gift. This is something that's been imparted by God's grace to you. And it's the same word that he's going to go on to use in talking about other gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 as he gives special focus to these kinds of gifts. He's saying this is one of them. Such contentedness and devotion and being anxious about the things of the Lord, that is one of these grace gifts. But here he references this gift that he himself has received, right? That contented, devoted singleness. And he's quick to acknowledge, not everybody has this gift. Others have received gifts of another kind, like making disciples and following Christ within all of the duties and constraints of marriage. So, church, especially you who are unmarried or widowed, trust the Lord to give to you good gifts. Trust his wisdom. Trust his providence. That wherever you are in your stage of life, you can trust him, that he knows what he is doing. He is not withholding from you a good gift because he's evil or he doesn't know what's going on or he just can't find that right person to bring into your life. He knows what he's doing and you can trust him. Consider even how the letter begins. As Paul is opening up this letter to this troubled church, do you remember how he begins in chapter 1? Giving thanks to God for this church. Just reflect back on some of the things that we've seen, some of the church problems that we've seen. This divisive, litigious, sexually immoral, sin-harboring church. Paul praised God for them. Why? Because of the grace of God that was given to them. That in every way, this church, and I would argue all churches since, have been enriched in Christ in all speech and all knowledge, even as the testimony about Christ was confirmed among you. Why? So that you are not lacking in any gift. God's grace is effective towards you so that you are not lacking in any gift as you wait for the revealing of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will sustain you. He knows how to give you good gifts, and he is supplying to the church every gift that we need to help us corporately make it to that last day when we behold Christ, not by faith, but by sight. And so in your present stage of life, press into his providence in your life. Press in to his wisdom, that he knows what he is doing as he orders and structures all things. Now, let me be clear, though. I don't think that this gift that Paul is speaking about, I don't think the gift is singleness in and of itself. I don't think that's what he has in view, if that isn't clear enough by now. If that were the case, then the command in verse 9 would be completely unnecessary. Right? If it were that this gift that he is saying was just singleness generally, then he doesn't need to issue the command in verse 9. And the married among us, we need to know that platitudes about the opportunities that singleness affords, it can sting. It can sting. Like when you lose a loved one and someone just kind of lobs over the fence at you. Oh, God works together all things. Like in your grief, that doesn't help. It hurts. It may be true, but it still cuts. Right? Now, we might not say that very thing to those among us who are unmarried. It instead may sound more like, oh man, your quiet times must be so rich not having the interruptions of kids. Or, I wish I didn't have to plan my discipleship group around my husband's schedule. Right? Those who are unmarried, that may cut deep because they desire nothing more than to have children, than to have a spouse. That they would love to have those things. And it may be true that they have those opportunities and it is easier in some respects, but in the moment, it hurts. And it hurts. It hurts you who are unmarried. It hurts because you have not received the gift of contented devotion to the things of the Lord. You want to be married. And that makes the command of verse 9 all the harder. Paul, he writes here in verse 9, this command: if they do not have self-control, let them get married. All right, so he has in mind a category of those who do not share his gift, who desire to be married, yet at present are unmarried. And he describes this group as those who do not have self-control. All right, it's not an issue of ability, as what the ESV and many translations try to indicate. That verb about ability, it's not there in what Paul wrote. That's not what he's describing. Right, that's an addition by the translator to try to help make sense of what it is that Paul is writing. And so he is not saying that there are unmarried people who are unable to be self-controlled. That's not his focus. He is not saying that if you are consumed with passion and just cannot control yourself, well, then go ahead and just get married. That is not how he is understanding and thinking of marriage. I would say that is a rather foolhardy way to enter into marriage. So I just can't control myself, so I'm just going to go ahead and get married. Right? If you are not self-controlled before marriage, what makes you think you're going to be self-controlled after you get married? You can't view marriage as that silver bullet that will fix your lack of self-control. That is viewing marriage like a ceramic pig chef. It will bring about destruction. That's not a right way to understand marriage. Rather, if you don't have the same gift that Paul has with your passions constrained and your contented devotion to the Lord, if you don't have that gift, if that's not you, it is better, he is saying, that you get married than try to squash your desires in vain pursuit of a dreamt up hyper-spirituality and burn with passion. Right? He still has this dualistic frame of reference in view that is a problem there in Corinth. Right? Like, well, it would be better if I just remain single. I'd be more spiritual. I'd be more used to the Lord. And so even though I have these desires to get married, to have children, and to be with a spouse, well, I'm going to push those down because this is the more spiritual thing. Say, no, don't do that. It is better that you marry than that you burn with passion. But that command to just be married, right? It's hard to convey this in English, right? But he issues an imperative, get married. It's not that easy, is it? It's like, well, that's one command that's kind of hard for me to obey, Paul. That may be what you're thinking. I would love nothing better than to get married. But how do I do this? How am I supposed to obey this command? If you aren't gifted as Paul is, right? This is one category of people. He's introducing, I think, this third category. If you're not gifted as he is, contentedly devoted to the Lord, neither have you been gifted with marriage. Right? Here's this third group where you're unmarried, but you desire to be. Right? And obeying Paul's command to marry, it's not always exactly within your control. You've made attempts. You tried to meet a godly man or woman, but marriage, it just has not come together for you. And I'm not going to lie to you. Praying more, pursuing godliness more, being a more marriable person, focusing on your relationship with Christ more, those are good things. Those are good things for you to do and to consider, but friend, they are not levers to pull. They're not levers to pull. If only you do X, then God will give you a spouse. Perhaps you've heard sentiments like that conveyed. But friend, that's the heretical logic of prosperity theology. If only you do X, well then God will be bound to give you Y. I'm believing in God because he'll give me what I want. That's not the right way to go about it. There may, in fact, be personal things contributing to your unfulfilled desires. Men, you may need to ambitiously assume more responsibility. That may be a thing that you need to give careful thought to. Ladies, you may need to recalibrate your expectations. Something to discuss with those who know you well, to bring up in your discipleship group. But we can lament with you over a gift that has not yet been given. We can acknowledge that it is hard, and we can pray with you and even strategize with you about ways to meet someone. But best of all, we can point you to trust in God to give you good gifts. That he will do this, even if those gifts are not what you think you need. We can walk alongside of you in that wrestling of faith, that you might trust in him to do what is best. Marriage, it is a good thing. It is a good thing to desire. In it, God, he does give good gifts. And yet, marriage is not the end. That's not the goal for all of life. It is a means to the end. And the same is true of singleness. Singleness is not the end. When we set up either marriage or singleness as the chief objective of our lives, as that great end, we've set up a ceramic pig chef. It's empty and ready to be broken. Instead, we need to interact both with marriage and with singleness as the means that God intended. To see them for the gifts that they are. They are means by which the Lord is known and is made known. So just consider how the Lord described the redemption of his people in the framework of marriage in Hosea 2. Listen to this. Therefore, this is how God speaks of his people. Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice and steadfast love and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. It's beautiful. That's the goal that marriage is helping us understand. And yet God says to the unmarried, another promise. Listen to Isaiah 56:5. To you who are unmarried, God says, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name that is better than sons and daughters. I will give them, those who are unmarried, an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. That's what God promises to you. Whether you look on marriage from the inside as a spouse or as you press on unmarried. The end is that you would know the Lord, that you would trust in him, that you would know that you can trust him to give to you all that you need.